My name is Nick Jones. I am a software engineer professionally. I've worked a little bit in the civic tech world and a number of other places, and like to spend a lot of time on sort of side projects related to the civic tech world and civic data and things like this. So this talk is going to be about NYCHA and NYCHA data, specifically relating to heat failures. I am not affiliated at all with NYCHA. I'm just sort of an interested and curious person. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about today, we'll start off just talking a little bit about what NYCHA is for those who aren't familiar with it. NYCHA stands for New York City Housing Authority, and every time I've ever heard it pronounced, it's pronounced NYCHA. So sorry, I realized that I didn't explain that as I started to talk about it. We'll then talk about whether the data that NYCHA publishes specifically about heating failures, what we can find out about that data, find out based on that data. So yeah, we'll focus specifically on heating failures and try to answer things like which developments have heating failures the most often, how long do they take to resolve, which sort of seem like seemingly simple questions that we'll discover in sort of the later part are not so simple. And then we'll talk a little bit about how the underlying reporting systems and software that is used behind the scenes impacts the data that's available and how we can analyze it or not. The goals of this talk, we're not actually going to do any specific data analysis. We'll look a little bit at some data, but the goal isn't to really get deep in any particular analysis. It's more to sort of understand the whole story that goes into what we sometimes think of just as one data point. We'll talk a little about how much definitions matter and how really understanding exactly what you're measuring is really important. We'll talk about how humans being involved with any process is complicated. And so the numbers that you're going to see are impacted by humans and decisions they make. So it's not always quite as straightforward. And then we'll finally just sort of wrap it up talking about how understanding all this context is really important before you can actually try to answer questions with data. So really quickly, we'll just go through a little bit of what NYCHA is for people who aren't familiar. It's a very complicated agency. I won't try to get into too much detail. Funding is also quite complicated, but the sort of important things for this particular talk is that it's funded by a combination of federal money and residents' rent. And then there's a number of other sources, but there's a lot of federal funding that goes into NYCHA's budget. NYCHA is enormous. It's the largest landlord in the city. There are over 300 developments, over 2,000 residential buildings, and over 160,000 apartments. So there's something like 400 to 600,000 people living in NYCHA housing. I believe the 400,000-ish number is sort of official count, but there are actually a lot more people that live there that aren't necessarily sort of on the city's books. So it's really big. There's an article, it's linked a little bit below here, Rachel Holiday Smith of The City, which is a newsroom that has a mildly confusing name. So when I say the city in this talk, it's referring to them and not New York City. But they compared the size of the number of people that live in NYCHA housing to Miami, Atlanta, Cleveland, New Orleans, and Tampa. So if you were to take the entirety of people that live in NYCHA housing, you'd get basically a mid-sized city in the United States. I tried to put a map on this slide, but sort of due to New York City's shape, it's a little bit hard to see. But basically, this just tries to give you an idea of where NYCHA developments are, and they're basically all over the city. And so if you want to look this up after the talk, you'll probably get a better image. So NYCHA's had a history of a wide range of issues. We're going to talk just about heating today, but the reason I mention this here is that there are two sources that I looked into for some of what we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So there was a federal monitor appointed in 2018 to sort of oversee NYCHA, and that's why I mentioned the federal funding earlier. This monitor was put in place because of how much funding NYCHA receives from the federal government. With that federal monitor, they put out quarterly reports on a number of different issues, including heatings. We'll end up referencing some of their reports a little bit later. And then the city comptroller did an audit in 2020, also specifically related to heating issues in NYCHA developments. The relevant thing here is that they write these reports that are really useful for actually understanding some of the data that ends up getting published, and even goes to some of the details of how NYCHA operates sort of behind the scenes and the systems that they use to track data. As many of you or anyone in New York knows, there is this concept of heat season. Basically, between October and May, landlords need to keep their buildings heat above 68 degrees during the day and above 62 at night. And NYCHA is a very large landlord, so they also fall underneath this law. And as I sort of hinted at, NYCHA has had many issues with keeping the heat on across all of their buildings and developments. These are just a couple of headlines from the last few years. I think it was the 2017-2018 heat season was particularly bad. That's the article on the right, where something like 80% of people living in NYCHA housing lost heat at one point or another during that winter. So it's a really big problem, and it's not a new one, but it's been going on for kind of a long time. And so one particular paragraph in an article that the city wrote caught my eye, and it was talking specifically about Marble Hill, one of the developments in the Bronx, and it mentioned this service interruptions portal, which is a website that NYCHA runs that puts out current and historical information about various outages that they're experiencing at different locations. And the part that stuck out to me was that people were having these issues at Marble Hill. They didn't have heat, and the service interruptions portal didn't actually report that they didn't have heat at the time. So that sort of got me really interested in why was that the case? If this is the place that this data is published, why are these particular cases not showing up? And so before we get into some of the data and the systems behind all of this, I just wanted to take a second to pause and sort of just recognize that, like, we're going to talk about numbers, we're going to talk about data. Having no heat in the winter is horrible. And if we see some data point that 600 people were affected by an outage, like, that's a lot of people, and those are 600 lives that were impacted really horribly. So we're going to talk about technology and data kind of for the rest of it, but I just wanted to acknowledge it's a really big problem, and behind that data are real human lives. So some of the questions we sort of started with before were these descriptive things, like which developments and buildings are suffering heat failures most often, how many people are impacted, how long does it take to restore when heat does go out. So there's 2 additional articles or examples this winter that we'll use to look through this. One was in Parks East, and this was in January and February. And there are a few quotes below from the article talking about basically having intermittent heat outages regularly. And then another one in December at Classen Point Gardens. The thing that was sort of notable about this article is that it wasn't that all buildings were losing heat. It was ones that were literally like the furthest from the boiler. And so this is sort of a different scenario, which I'll talk a little bit about in a few minutes, where some portion of the buildings were losing heat. It wasn't everyone. So based on those articles and the experiences of those people, we would expect to find in the data that there was no heat in parts of January and February at Twin Parks East. And then the Classen Point article was specifically talking about part of a week in December. So we would expect to see that in the data. So this is the screenshot of the service interruptions portal or overview that was mentioned before. As you can see, there are a number of tabs for heat and water outages, elevator issues, electric issues, gas issues, and then the history tab lets you look through a bunch of the history of any of these service interruptions. And so if you go into the history tab, you can actually narrow it down to a specific development, can narrow down the date range and only look at a specific outage type. And so with Twin Parks, we see, just looking at this year, that there are 4 outages mentioned, but they're all kind of brief. They all are resolved within 12 or so hours. So that sort of, but doesn't completely line up with what people were actually experiencing that was referenced in the previous article. And then Classen Point, the article again talks about between December 5th and 9th. If we look at the data, we change the filters here and look at the data in that time range, we see that there was one roughly 12-hour outage on December 8th, which doesn't really line up with what people were experiencing for 4 or 5 days at a time. It doesn't quite seem like what people are experiencing is being reflected in that data. And if you're really careful about reading this, you can see that these are referred to as outages. And so that sort of got me curious about what is an outage and how are they defining an outage, and is that part of this picture? And before we answer that, we're going to think through the whole lifespan of how that data actually gets collected and published on that dashboard. So one thing that's different with people who live in NYCHA resident or developments versus people who live in private housing, if you're having an issue with heat in private housing, you tell your landlord. If your landlord's unresponsive, you can submit a 311 complaint. With NYCHA, everything goes through just NYCHA. So there's no 311. They're told not to use 311. There are a number of ways they can report an issue. There's a phone number, there are in-person kiosks, and there's a mobile app and a website called My NYCHA. So this is a diagram of what I just explained, but in a bit more detail. This is based on comptroller audit that I mentioned a little bit earlier, where these different systems are actually involved behind the scenes. So a person can walk in, they can call, in which case an employee is actually entering the data of this particular complaint into what's called Siebel, which is a scheduling system, which automatically uploads that same data or similar data to what's called Maximo, which is a work order tracking system. And that's actually mostly what we'll focus on. So anyways, this is just sort of a general idea of what happens when someone's actually reporting an issue. We'll now kind of jump over to answer that question about what is an outage. And this comes from one of the federal monitor reports that I mentioned before. Sorry, there are a few slides coming up that are like large blocks of text. I will summarize them, but I'll send these out later. So if you want to read the whole thing. But basically what it's telling us is that outage or heat failures fall into roughly two buckets. One is what they call an outage. And an outage is a systemic failure. It's affecting the entire number of units. It mentions specifically here like a boiler issue or something that's affecting the entire building or some larger unit. And then the second scenario is an individual unit, or it could be multiple units as well. But the underlying issue is not something more systemic that's affecting the entire building. And one of the important things to note in that last sentence that NYCHA mainly focuses on tracking and correcting outages because they impact more units. So basically in these two scenarios, NYCHA has received this complaint. They determine that it's a system-wide issue, and now it's called an outage. And in that second scenario, it is not called an outage. It's perhaps still a heating failure, but they don't determine to be a system-wide outage. So now we can shift to okay, you're gonna get some data and you can analyze it. Let's think about what actual data is being created in both of these scenarios. So this also actually comes from the comptroller report. I didn't just make this up. Basically, when that complaint is first received, they create what's called a corrective work order in Maximo. And if they've determined that it is this systemic failure that is considered an outage, they close that original order and they create a new one for a type outage in Maximo. Quick disclaimer on the couple of tables I'm going to show. This is how I'm imagining it might actually exist behind the scenes. I don't actually know this as a fact, but it is sort of to demonstrate how you might think about this in other scenarios. So we have this corrective maintenance order that I mentioned that gets closed out once they've determined that it's a systemic issue, and they open a new work order of type outage. And there's some times associated with both of those. And the idea in this first scenario is that once that outage work order is closed, they can say, okay, we had an outage was opened at a particular time and it was closed at another time. And that's sort of how they're defining the life cycle of the outage. In the second scenario, the data being created is a little bit more complicated. So again, I won't read this whole thing, but the first part is basically saying that, the system being used isn't really meant to track the total time to resolve an individual heat-related complaint. It's just used for work orders. And so if the work order is an outage type, that's easy for them to understand. You can look at when it was open and when it was closed. But for these individual issues, Maximo isn't really set up to do that. This example is based on the previous paragraph. Basically what it's saying is you start with that same work order that's saying we had an issue, someone look into it. They determine that it's not a systemic one and instead say, oh, there's an issue with plumbing, so we need a plumber to go fix it. Plumber goes and fixes something, and that takes some amount of time. They close that work order. Plumber says that, we need a plasterer to take care of something that isn't completely done. We need a plasterer to come in. Plasterer comes in, new work order. They do whatever they need to do. Finally, they say, we need a painter to paint over and finish whatever it was that was causing this original heat issue. And so there's this final work order created. But the problem is that there's no actual correlation between any of these work orders. So what you have is there was a plumber who had to come in and they, I don't know if it was related to a heat outage. I don't know if it was because there was an issue with the plumbing unrelated to heat. And so we actually don't know, just based on the data that's stored there, how long it took to fix the heating issue. And so this one other highlight is basically just saying that, and that if you want to actually determine how long a particular complaint took to resolve, if it was not an outage, if it was one of these individual issues, there's no systemic way to do that. You have to go kind of through each individual ticket and probably read the context or something around it and determine this is where all, this plumber ticket was related to this other one. And this all kind of rolls up into the original heat complaint. Just to sort of summarize, the outages in that scenario one are what at least I have interpreted to be what's reported on the service interruptions page. But when there are individual unit failures that are determined to not be this more systemic issue, those don't show up in that data. And from my knowledge, they're not reported anywhere publicly. What does this kind of all tell us? The service interruptions overview, which gives some insight into what's happening and heat issues that people are having, doesn't paint a full picture because it sort of excludes these individual issues. And given that it's sort of, there are issues tracking those internally, making that public might not actually be helpful for people trying to answer the questions that we started with. So if we return to those original questions, we kind of discover that we can't really answer these based on what's available. I think there's some instinct, and this is sort of me speaking from a software engineer, data person point of view. I think a desire to see a table of data and say, well, okay, let's jump in, let's figure out, we have some questions, let's just answer them right away. And in reality, these questions are kind of unanswerable, at least with what's available. The sort of takeaways for me around all this were that think about some of the underlying software systems that actually impact open data and data analysis, even the ones that are more nicely formatted, unlike the open data portal. That all came from somewhere, and it may have been entered by a person. It may have gone through a number of different transformations, and the way that was actually handled can impact what is published. It's really important to understand what is being measured. So I think I read one of those articles 3 times, and I was like, these are outages. Why? How does this not line up? And so understanding the definitions of the things that you're trying to analyze is really, really important. And so understanding your context is also really important. That's kind of it. These are most of the articles that were mentioned, like a comptroller report or like a NYCHA federal monitor report. At first, it's not the most fascinating thing. You kind of got to get through a little bit of it. And then I found it to actually be really interesting and insightful for why you're seeing what you might be seeing. That's all I have. So anyone have questions, comments, feel free to either unmute yourself or is the server interruption overview populated by Maximal or is it updated manually? Are complaint inputs recorded? That's a great question. And I am also curious about that. I don't actually know the answer though. I'm not sure if it is populated automatically. Are complaint inputs recorded? I do know there were other reports that I didn't highlight. I do know that they're able to determine the number of corrective maintenance orders. My understanding is that that's basically the number of complaints. And so they can determine how many complaints came in, but they have a harder time figuring out. And I think they can determine how many of those were outages and how many of those were individual complaints. But once you get into the individual complaints, I don't think they're able to answer those other questions, like how long did it take to resolve and so forth. Another question, given what we know about the limits to the outages data, can we answer the question of which developments have the most outages each winter? So outages, yes. As far as I know, at least, that data is in the service interruptions overview. It's not a particularly easy format. You can't click export CSV or Excel or something, but I do think that information is there, and they might include in the Federal Monitor quarterly reports. It's possible that they break that down. There is a lot of information in those, so it's possible that those are included there. But yeah, the data in theory exists on the website. Can errors entered be corrected? That is a great question. I imagine there is a way to do that. I don't know if someone submitted a complaint and it was related to an outage and it got published on the service interruptions overview, and then they determined that it wasn't an outage or that it lasted 2 days instead of just 4 hours. I don't know if there would be any issues with updating that. Yeah, so I don't have a good answer to that. Were there any specific developments or boroughs that are constant offenders? Maybe have a pattern? That is a great question. And it's sort of one that I wish we could answer better, because we could answer it about the outages, the systemic outages based on the data that's on the service interruptions portal, but we couldn't answer more accurately to include the individual complaints too. Looking at the service interruption site. So the data, it exists, but I don't think, so there's a tab on the right of it that I think it's just called history. So there is a history tab up here, but as I sort of briefly mentioned, the data isn't structured in any way. So you can't just export it. It's this table and you might have to manually do it or write some code to parse it out. I did find a project of someone whose name I'm forgetting because I didn't know them, who had written a little scraper that basically takes, I don't think it was historical data. I think it was just the current outages, and basically goes through the web page and spits out a CSV or an Excel file or something so that you could analyze that data more easily. Oh, and it sounds like there is, great, that's awesome. This is being built. Okay, so I'm glad someone mentioned 311s. 311 data, you can access it on the Open Data Portal, or BetaNYC has their board stat website where you can access that 311 data a little bit more easily. But none of the data around heating complaints from NYCHA residents will show up in 311 data, is my understanding, because they have to go separately through NYCHA specifically. The other thing that I think is interesting about the 311, or the sort of difference between 311 and what NYCHA collects, is that with 311, my understanding is that basically it's a person who you're reporting that your landlord hasn't fixed your heat problem, but it's not tracking, we need a plumber to come fix this thing, or we need, the boiler's a problem or whatever. It's basically just tracking, like, is there a problem and when was it resolved, which makes it a little bit easier to kind of track because it's less detailed. But yeah, so it is interesting to sort of think that, like, 311 data does exist on this same issue for private housing, and it's a lot easier to work with. Yeah, thanks for coming out. I hope this was interesting and was what you were expecting, or at least interesting.